The river and the water cycle. The water cycle has everything to do with the formation of the river over time. Let's take a look at the water cycle. Evaporation happens when liquid water becomes a gas called water vapor. It's invisible and we can't see it, but it's everywhere around us and it floats high up into the sky. Evaporation happens faster when it's a sunny day because the warmth of the sun speeds up the process of the liquid turning to gas. When there is a combination of cool air and warm air, and the air pressure in the sky becomes low, the water molecules bounce around more and combine into condensation or the formation of liquid from a gas. When that condensation occurs, we see the formation of a cloud in the sky. That cloud in the sky holds the water as either water droplets or snowflakes, depending on the temperature and how cold the air is around us. When the rain or snow inside that cloud builds up and the cloud becomes heavy and the air temperature and the air pressure are right, something amazing happens. Precipitation. Precipitation is when the clouds release all of that moisture, whether it's a raindrop or sleet or snow, and it releases it down from the cloud to fill the sky and cover the ground. Precipitation is what gives us the water that we have on Earth. Whether it becomes water in the form of snow, that snow will eventually melt and become water again, or water in the form of rain. And rain is a liquid that will give us the water that all the plants and all the animals need in order to survive. If we get enough rain, we end up with puddles. Puddles are a form of water collection. When the rain falls, it has to go somewhere, so it finds the lowest spot to collect. And in this case, it's a puddle in a farm field. Water can also collect in streams and rivers when the snow melts in the springtime. The water from snowmelt is very important for the plants to start growing again. Sometimes that water from snowmelt sits on the ground like a puddle, and that puddle will eventually drain into the soil so the plant's roots can use that water to help them grow. But sometimes there's so much water on the ground that it becomes runoff. Runoff happens when there's too much water, and so water goes to the lowest point, and by doing that, it will usually end up in our rivers and our lakes. When the water from runoff goes into the river, it either seeps into the river from people's yards or it goes through something called a culvert, like what you see here. A culvert is a big pipe that helps to take the water that's coming off of the ground and focus it into an area on the river or a lake where we want it to go. When that water comes together from all the different areas, it's often dirty water because it's collected everything that it meets as it's flowing downward. The water is often dirty from soil and dirt that gets into the water as it comes down into the river. But sometimes there's other pollution that gets into that water and makes it dirty too. So some of that precipitation collects in our rivers, but it also collects in our lakes and in our oceans. All of these types of water are part of the water cycle, and they're very important to the animals that live there. This is all part of the planet Earth.
On our planet, things change over time. Sometimes things change over a short amount of time, like the span of a year or even a few months. For example, over the year, we have 4 different seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. This is the progression of time, and time is based on the way our planet moves. In 24 hours, our planet rotates 1 time, either facing the sun or away from the sun. The Earth sits on an angle toward the sun and rotates every day. As it rotates, it looks like the sun is moving across the sky, but actually the Earth is rotating in a circle and either facing the sun during the day or facing away from the sun at night. It all depends on where we are standing on the Earth at that point in time. The Earth is a planet in our solar system, and it revolves around the sun. It takes 365 days for the Earth to revolve completely around the sun, which is equal to 1 year. Because the Earth sits on a tilt, we are either facing closer to the sun or further away from the sun during that 365 days, and that gives us the 4 seasons. Each of those seasons offers a little bit of different weather because of our location to the sun. In the winter, we are tilted furthest away from the sun, so it's cold and the days are shortened. In spring, we're tilted so we receive equal amounts of sunlight and darkness, and the days begin to warm up. In summer, we're tilted closest to the sun, and the days are longer and warmer. But by fall, we're beginning to tilt away from the sun again, so the days are getting shorter and colder until winter returns. On the first actual day of winter, we see the least amount of daylight, so it's the shortest day of the year. On the first actual day of summer, we see the most amount of daylight, so it's the longest day of the year. Once fall comes, we're back to equal day length as it becomes closer to the first day of winter and the shortest day of the year. So that's an overview of time and how time can control changes that happen in nature. Sometimes those changes can happen within months, like changing the colors on the trees over the seasons, but sometimes these changes happen over decades, which can be 10 years, centuries, which can be 100 years, or millenniums, which can be 1,000 years. These changes are often done because of the power of water and the power of our weather. The power of water can be so forceful that it can separate chunks of land from the mainland. These are called islands. When an island is formed, it's often because water has separated it from the original mainland. Another thing water does to land is erosion. Erosion happens when water and the force of the water over the top of the soil moves that soil and pushes it downward into the river or lake. And so it basically tears away the topsoil that holds all the plants on there, which is not necessarily a very good thing for a river, because when it erodes, the water becomes very dirty. Erosion typically happens because of rain. When there is a heavy rainfall and the water levels increase, the power of the water moves faster and collects all of the dirt from the shoreline. Sometimes this exposes the roots on the trees of the shoreline. Sometimes that causes trees to fall or the land to flood, which also creates erosion. But eventually, over time, things will go back to normal because the water will move away from the river or evaporate back into the sky. These events happen over a short amount of time, But if they continue and continue to happen, they will eventually create some long-term changes in the land. And these will happen over a long period of time. Today we'll be going on a virtual hike, and you'll be joining me to explore some of the changes that have happened over time at Thousand Islands. I'm looking forward to it, and we'll see you soon.
Hi friends, my name is Mrs. Firestein and we're at Thousand Islands today. We're going to be looking at the river and the changes that happen to the river over time. We're going to compare things that happen to the river over a long amount of time or a short amount of time.
My first question for you is, what is a river? How does a river form?
Water is always moving downward because of gravity. So when we think of water moving from one area to another, it moves from the higher elevation or the higher area of land to the lower elevation or the lower area of land, where it eventually empties out into another body of water.
An interesting fact about the Fox River is that even though the river starts in Lake Winnebago, which is lower on the map than the Bay of Green Bay where it ends, the river still flows from a higher elevation in Neenah to a lower elevation in Green Bay. My next question for you is, what is erosion and what causes erosion?
The amount of water in a river and the rate of how fast or slow it moves changes with the amount of rainfall we get. When there's a lot of rainfall, the river is high and the water moves fast. This water pushes against the shoreline and causes something called erosion. So if you look carefully here, I'm standing right on the edge of a shelf of land that has been eroded by the river. When the water is high, like it is today, this shelf of land gets the water pushing up against it until the soil starts to pull away from the land and it goes into the river. That is called erosion. Okay, so here's a question for you. If there's too much water in the river, where does the extra water go? When there's too much water for the river to hold, the water has to go somewhere. So it finds the lowest area on the outside edges of the river, and this area becomes what's called the floodplain. The floodplain is the land along the river that is lower than the banks, so that the water that is extra in the river flows down into this area.
As you're looking from above the river, you can see over to the side where the land becomes a little bit lower. This is the floodplains where we walk through. You can see the trails right there.
Floodplains can be filled with water for a long time if the water level in the river is high. But if there isn't rain for a long time, then the floodplains stay empty and dry until the next big rainfall. When the floodplains are empty and dry, there's no plants that grow there. There's an occasional bunch of grass that will grow here and there. But the ground underneath the water pretty much stays just flat, plain mud.
Okay, friends, so here's another shot of an aerial picture over the top of the islands at Thousand Islands. How could you describe an island? What's the definition of an island?
An island is a piece of land that's surrounded by water. So this is just a little mini island holding just a couple of trees but because it is surrounded by water, it's considered an island. Out in the middle of the river, there are several islands. You can see them. As long as they are surrounded by water, they're considered an island. In fact, if you look way in the distance, all of the land on the other side of the river in this part, near Thousand Islands, those are all little mini islands over there. That's why we call it Thousand Islands. Except there's not 1,000 islands. There's maybe 50. So how are these islands formed? Well, these islands are formed because the water continues to erode the soil, just like we saw the erosion over on the shoreline. So as the water passes over, especially in a floodplain, passes over the soil, it removes the soil, takes that soil away, and separates that little piece of land from the rest of the land. As that soil becomes more and more eroded, as you can see here, the land becomes water all around the outside of the island. That's what forms an island. Do you think that an island is formed in a short amount of time or a long amount of time? Islands can be formed in a short amount of time if there's an extreme amount of water that changes the landscape. But typically, an island isn't formed over a short amount of time. It usually takes a very long time for the island to become separated from the soil, from the mainland. There are other kinds of islands that are formed as well. So islands can be formed from a tree that falls in the water. So the tree that falls in the water, as you can see here, eventually that tree starts to accumulate or build up more soil around its branches as things pile up on it from the water flowing past. That's another way for an island to develop.
So islands that are in an ocean are a little bit different than what we have here, because islands that are in an ocean are formed because of either an earthquake or a volcano that happens to disrupt the land below the ocean. And then that land comes up out of the water and forms its own little island. That's a lot different from what we have here. The islands that we have here are already on land, so these are considered continental islands. But because they are surrounded by water in a river or a lake or something that's already within the land on our continent, those islands are different from ocean islands.
Friends, if you look very carefully at this island, this is kind of interesting. In the center of the screen is an island that was flipped upside down by either the wind or the water. But all of the soil that made that island an island of its own has flipped up out of the ground, and the tree that was on it looks like it has fallen over. So here's another view of that island that tipped over. You can see there was a tree, and that tree tipped right over. And so all the soil that had built up around the roots of that tree came up out of the water. And now that island is tipped on its side. So there's a chance that things might start growing on that again. But because of the elevation of that chunk of soil with the roots on it, I think over time the soil will have rain erode down into the river, and that will eventually no longer be an island.
Friends, I hope you were able to learn a little bit more about the river and how the river changes over time through erosion from water and rainfall, through the development of islands or the lack of rainfall and the loss of islands. How these changes can dictate how the river will look over a long period of time or even over a short period of time. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon.